Okay, the list that I have here is what we're actually fixing to locate or figure out for each of the graphs that I'm fixing to give you. So I'm fixing to do 3 examples, and you will be asked to identify all 5 parts here, okay? Of course, domain and range we've talked about, but we're going to have to look at it a little bit different than we did a while ago. Like when I was doing domain and range earlier, it was just a matter of listing out the points. We'll actually have to use interval notation with some of the problems that we're going to do in just a little bit. One thing I do want you to remember about domain when you look at a graph, remember to look at your graph from the left to the right. And when you do your range, we're going to look at it from the bottom to the top. Okay, and that just helps you out in being able to get the interval notation written correctly. If you always look at your graph from the left side to the right side for domain, and then for your range, look at it from the bottom to the top, and you'll see more of what I'm talking about when we look at a graph. Then you have to identify the intercepts. Of course, you've done this before numerous times. X-intercepts, that's just where your graph crosses your x-axis. Y-intercepts, where your graph crosses your y-axis. And when it states about function's value, that's actually what we just finished doing, was getting a function's value, but it'll have listed below the graph of exactly what they're wanting you to identify there. Okay, so here is the first one that we're going to look at. So when you sketch this off, you will need to make sure that you have a few points that are definitely marked, like for instance, clearly marked, say this point, and this point. More so the one at the top for sure. You need to make sure you know where that is. Okay, so sketch that off, and starting with A part, which was the domain. Now, the reason why I can't just list the domain like I did before is because there's an endless amount of numbers that are being used by this graph. Because, like for instance, of course, like you have x equals 0, there it is. Then you would have x equal 0.1, there it is. And then 0.2, there it is. But, I mean, you have an endless amount of numbers, that are just between 0 and 1, and every single one of those is on that graph, because you've got all those decimals and fractions. So that's why you cannot list all of them. You have to use interval notation. Now with domain, the reason why I said look at it from the left side to the right side is because that is your x-axis, and domain is in reference to x. So what I want you to ask yourself is, when you look at the left, ask yourself, does this graph go to the left forever? And it does. I mean, you wouldn't have probably told me that. Like if I said, which way does it go, you probably would have said down. But as it goes down, I mean on this side and also on this side, it's gradually getting wider and wider and wider as it goes down. So it is going to the left forever. So then ask yourself, what about the right? Does it go to the right forever? Yes, same thing that I just explaining. It gradually widens. So if it goes to the left forever, it goes to the right forever, then your domain would have to be negative infinity to positive infinity. That means every x number that you can come up with, you would be able to locate a point on the graph. Okay, B part was range. Now what I told you with range was bottom to top. Okay, so ask yourself, does it go down forever? Yes, these two arrows indicate that it goes down forever. So you're going to say that your range starts at negative infinity. Okay, then ask yourself, does it go up forever? Remember I said bottom to top. Now no part of this graph goes up forever, because once you reach this point, that's as high as this graph goes in reference to the y-axis. Now range is y, so when we're stopping at this point, you need to use its y value, not its x value, because range is y. So the y value of this point is 4. You would put a bracket on it because the 4 is included. I mean, that point is on that graph, so therefore you'd put a bracket. So that means your y values, like if you start looking at all your y's along your y-axis, everything from 4 all the way down forever is included in that range. But when you write interval notation, you remember you have to go like smaller to bigger. So that's why I said always do left to right and then do bottom to top. Okay? Alright, C part was x-intercept or septs. You can have more than one. And you do have 2 x-intercepts. Again, that's just where your graph crosses your x-axis. List those as ordered pairs. So this would be the point -3, 0. And this would be the point 1, 0. So that's all there is to that. D is your y-intercept. So where does your graph go across your y-axis? And that would be at +3. So again, list that as an ordered pair. So that would be 0, 3. Okay, E. Now this is where it said the function's value that's listed below the graph. That's these two. So first of all, they want to know what f of -2 is. Now this is the same thing that I was doing just a few minutes ago. So this is x. So I'll go on my x-axis to -2. I move up to my graph and I see that my y value at that point is +3. Okay, then do the same thing for f of 2. So I go on my x-axis to +2. I would have to shift down this time, and this graph is actually coming across right there, and the y value of that point is -5. Okay, next one. Okay, so again, take just a second and sketch that off. And then we're going to go through and answer exactly the same questions that we did just a few minutes ago. Now, I don't have any definite points marked on this one, because actually as long as you run this along your x-axis and through the origin, you can just kind of estimate this part of it right here. Really actually not having an exact point there is not going to be a big difference. Well, no, I take that back. I'm sorry, because you are asked for f of 2. So, let's see, origin. Let me mark a point. Make sure you mark that one. And you could go ahead and mark that one. So, that would give you a couple of points that you can put on your graph. Okay, A part was domain. Now remember, domain is left to right. So, does it go to the left forever? Yes. So that means your domain is going to start at -infinity. Okay, you come along as the part of the graph that goes to the right forever? Yes, because as this piece goes up, it's gradually going to the right at the same time. So we'll have a domain of -infinity to +infinity again. Okay, B part was range. So this time we go bottom to top. So you ask yourself, is there any part of the graph that goes down forever? No, there's not. The first time that you get to this graph when you're starting from the bottom and coming up is going to be these points that are along this part of the graph. Now, range is y, so the y value, of all of those points, because they're all lined up side by side, the y value is 0. Now, those points are all included on the graph. So actually I need to put a bracket because it would start at 0 and then it does go up forever. So that would be 0 to infinity. Alright, C. Okay, x-intercepts. You have multiple correct or multiple x-intercepts. Okay, I mean, it's not occurring at just -1, -2. I mean, you've got all these numbers that are in between these whole numbers, and then it keeps going that way forever. And there's a couple of different ways to express it, and I should have looked it up before I started this. I don't remember exactly how the textbook writes it, but you could say you have the point, let's see, of course, if it's an x-intercept, let me just say n 0, because if it's an x-intercept, y is going to be 0. But then we'd have to say, well, n is going to be, n is, well, we can just write it as an inequality. Let's just say that n is less than or equal to 0. Okay, so see, that would be from here this way. So any number, I'm just letting n represent a number. N could be any number that is less than 0 would be a number that you could put here that would be correct. Okay. D is the y-intercept. The only place that it crosses the y-axis is the origin. So 0, 0. Okay, E, again, we go back to the function's values that are listed here at the bottom. So f of negative 2. Okay, so here's negative 2, my x value, but that puts me on my graph right there at that point, but the y value of that point is 0. And then f of positive 2. Okay, so here's x equal positive 2. You come up to your graph, locate that point. The y value of that point is positive 4. Okay, one more. And this one is just made up of 5 points. So again, sketch that off and make sure that you have those 5 points listed at the correct value. Now they didn't show that this is at negative 5 when they did this graph, but this point is located at negative 5. Okay, domain. Now the other two problems I had to use interval notation to do my domain, but if you remember, you know, my graphs were just one continuous line, just point after point after point. These points are not connected up. The only thing that's on this graph is those 5 points, and that's it. So on this one, you would go back to actually just being able to list your numbers. So since you can list your numbers, just use the braces. So we want x values first for domain. So this would be negative 5, negative 2. The x value here is 0. And then positive 1 and positive 4. Okay, range is y. The only y value that's used by all 5 of those points is negative 2. Okay, so this was A, this was B. Okay, C is x-intercepts. None of those points are on your x-axis, so no x-intercepts. D part is the y-intercepts. So this would be the point that intercepts my y-axis. So that's the point 0, negative 2. All right, E. Now, they're doing something a little bit different here. They don't have just a comma in between, like find this and then find this. They're wanting you to find these two things, but then add them together. So let me just write this, f of negative 5 plus f of 4. Okay, so let's do f of negative 5. So again, negative 5 is my x. My y value there is negative 2. So f of negative 5 is equal to negative 2, therefore I can replace it. Okay, f of 4. So here's my x-axis, or my x value of 4. Y value of that point is negative 2. Negative 2 plus negative 2 gives me an answer of negative 4. So you're still finding these two parts the same way that we did earlier, but then it's just asking you to add those two things together.